what actually is the Insurrection Act? Like, when does it get invoked? What's the precedent for it? What would happen if Trump were to do such a thing? Is that like Defcon 1 disaster time? Give me my options here.
So the Insurrection Act is a statute that goes back a very long ways. It was passed, ratified in 1807. So that's
Wow.
literally the Thomas Jefferson presidency. I mean, it's a very, very long time ago, right? The last time I believe it was invoked was George H.W. Bush during the Rodney King riots there out in Los Angeles. So it's been a ways, but essentially, so there is a longstanding norm in America that the U.S. military, so like actual Army, Navy, sailors, Marines, etc., cannot be used for domestic law enforcement purposes. And there's a Reconstruction era statute called the Posse Comitatus Act that puts that into federal law. The Insurrection Act is basically a statutory carve out. It's an exception to that, because when things get really, really bad and a state or locality has failed to prevent a descent into anarchy or outright lawlessness, that is when you can call in the troops, the literal actual troops, to enforce the law. And there is precedent for this. I mean, it's been invoked many times. Again, I think most recently was Rodney King, 1992. But I'll give you a very similar example, actually. So, look, God forbid. I mean, I'm not saying that this is a direct analogy, but I have been kind of teasing out this notion that what we're seeing playing out in Minnesota and elsewhere is this neo-Confederate John C. Calhoun sentiment. Well, after the actual Civil War started, so these shots were fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina on April 12th to 13th of 1861. It was only a few days after that Abraham Lincoln actually invoked, you guessed it, the Insurrection Act there to try to quash what was then an insurrection. Again, I'm not saying that we're there yet. I'm not saying that this is literally a civil war. Okay. I'm just saying that the legal arguments are actually very similar when you think about it. Now, I'm not sure that this particular statute is a panacea. I'm not sure that it is a be-all, end-all there, but you really have to end the notion of these so-called sanctuary states. And again, I think that using the funding tool as not just a shield, but also as a sword, I think is an underutilized and underexplored tactic here. Also, I mean, don't discount the possibility of actually potentially throwing some very high-profile lawsuits. I mean, this administration has not been afraid to prosecute Jim Comey, Tish James. I mean, a lot of high-profile people there. I mean, what about the possibility of prosecuting a Keith Ellison, a Jacob Fry, someone who was personally actively obstructing federal law enforcement there? You know, some of these very high-profile prosecutions can also send a pretty clear message as well, I think.
Well, okay, so I just read that the U.S. DOJ issued subpoenas to Tim Walz, Jacob Fry, the mayor of St. Paul, whose name I still cannot pronounce, and others in connection with a federal investigation into alleged obstruction of federal immigration officers. Well, there's no question they're obstructing federal immigration officers. I've said this 1,000 times. I'm going to say it 1,001. The lieutenant governor of Minneapolis told people to lay their bodies on the line when it comes to ICE. They are telling these people to obstruct, period. Most of them are. And then you've got signal chats, and there's an investigation into whether or not these individuals are connected to that. And you've got this organization Defend 612 that has links to people, one of the senators in Minnesota. So, what is sedition? What is treason? Does when you actively work as a government official to impede and obstruct federal law enforcement officers, what would these subpoenas beget? Is this a crime?
Well, look, it depends on drawing this line between trying to stir the people's passions in a very demagogic sense, which they've clearly done, versus personally directing that assets deliberately not assist with the feds. So that kind of gets us back to kind of the jail example, right? So if you're a state or local penitentiary there, again, I don't think that you necessarily actively have to assist the federal government when it comes to trying to, round up aliens, send them to immigration court and ultimately, send packing if they're here illegally, et cetera there. But you definitely cannot obstruct federal law. So if there's a criminal alien and ICE has a detainer that they want this guy sent to immigration court and eventually deported there, then you cannot just send that guy packing. And if Tim Walz or Jacob Fry personally put in various requests to try to do that there, then it seems to me that they would potentially be on the hook for some sort of obstruction sort of charge there. Sedition
Okay.
is
What is that?
pretty,
What is sedition? What does that mean? I just hear it's like when you're undermining your government. That's my broad understanding of the term.
Sedition, treason is pretty heavy stuff, right?
Okay.
I mean, sedition to me basically means an attempt to overthrow the regime. I mean, the folks back in, back in like the,
I'm like,
right? I mean, the men who signed the Declaration of Independence were arguably committing treason against King George III. They knew that, by the way. I mean, that's when they pledged their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor. So I guess some sedition can be morally just. I mean, America was basically founded on a morally just act of sedition. But I mean, given the fact that America is a generally functioning society today, sedition, like an attempt to literally topple, overthrow the regime, is pretty high stuff. And
Okay.
and that's a charge that in theory could also have the death penalty for sure attached with there. So
Wow.
I mean, I hedge a little bit when it comes
I
to
get it.
sedition.
Okay.
There was this,
Okay.
there was this whole debate about Mark Kelly, the Mark Kelly video.
Yes, with the
that whole video.
senators telling
Right.
the friggin' armed forces and the intelligence agencies to defy White House orders because if they're not lawful, who's determining whether they're lawful or not?
Right. So that's extremely dangerous stuff. But I also kind of hedged a little bit, Jillian, at that time there. I mean, is that sedition? Maybe. I mean, the answer is maybe. But that's about as tough a charge as it gets here. Sedition is historically really a true capital offense. So
Okay.
I try to hedge a little bit with that there. But
Okay.
I think some lower charges here, like obstruction of justice, obstruction of law enforcement operations there, that seems to be some much more easily obtainable lower hanging fruit.
All right, guys, if you like this clip and you want to watch the full episode, click here. And if you want more content like this, you can subscribe to the show by clicking here.